Let me start off by thanking both Joe and John for covering for me last week. I was so sick, but my intent was to actually speak on this lesson next week or last week as a follow-up to the week before. So in reality, this gave me 2 weeks to actually spend a lot of time on this, and we're going to go back and try to look at some more practical advice from the Bible as it pertains to marriage. Now, certainly, for those of us here who are married. If we are struggling in some regard within our marriage, or if our spouse is struggling in some regard, it's essential for both of us within that marriage bond to actually go back and try to consider what the root of the problem is. And so this morning, what I tried to do is actually go back and look at some of the common issues we see within marriage, and also try to spend a little bit of time on some practical advice from the Bible that really ought to make us think and actually also consider how it is that we approach these issues, and then also what are some of the remedies that we could look at for a number of these issues. And this is a little different than I've done in the past. You'll notice there doesn't appear to be a lot of verses on there. I'm not going to deal so much with specific issues as initially to start off with really some of what our mindset should be. And then we will talk about dealing with some common issues. I'll list them, but let's start off with a basic. And I think if we have a basic understanding of this, and as Christians we should, it will help us greatly for our marriages. Now, if you're here and you're not married, the chances are that you will be. So again, certainly this is still applicable. Let's start with a basic fact, and that is that human relationships include offenses. You know, it's interesting, Josh started off with Song of Solomon. We don't start off with Song of Solomon very often, and there's a lot of verses we wouldn't read from the pulpit there. If you've not read Song of Solomon and you're married or thinking about getting married, go back and spend some time. Song of Solomon, if I could summarize it easily from the pulpit, would be it is a book that talks about the wonderful beauty of romantic love, and that's to put it very mildly. But we all think that our marriages are going to be just like we read about in Song of Solomon. And for those of us who are married, go back and think about the one you were intending on marrying, and to be honest, you were love struck, right? It's all going to be perfect. Well, the truth of the matter is, all human relationships include offenses. Listen to what James 3:2 says, and this isn't normally a passage you would use to talk about marriage, but it does talk about human nature. James 3:2, for in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Now, if you go back and you begin to look at this word here, offend, in many things we offend all, it can be translated a lot of ways. Some of the definitions that are listed would be to trip, to err, to sin, to fall, or it's translated as offend, as we see here in the King James Version. And what James in James 3:2 actually does for us is he begins to lay out the human condition really as clearly as anybody can. And what he is basically saying is every single one of us, we err, we sin, we fall short, and we offend. And we do it, as he says, in many ways. And I would go so far as to say nobody probably really knows that any more than those of us who are married and have spouses. And so, as you look at what James writes here and you dig a little bit deeper, think about the impact of the words he uses. He uses the words all and any. And as I begin to think a little bit about that, here's what James is saying. Even if you were to look for a spouse that would meet every idea that you ever had about being married, that you have read about in romance novels or that you have seen on movies, you would still end up with a spouse who in some way would fall short, who would err, who would sin, and would still disappoint you. They would still frustrate you. The point is even if you thought you found the most perfect person in the world, they're still going to stumble. And not only that, so will you. And so as I begin to think about marriage and I begin to think about what James is saying here, we really ought to enter into marriage with this understanding that word all means all. There are no exceptions. And and let me say this, many people will look at other people's marriages and they think to themselves, they have the perfect marriage, right? Well, here's the thing. They probably do not have the perfect fairy tale marriage. They still have their own problems. The reasons you may not be aware of it is because they're dealing with those issues in the way that they ought to be dealt with. And I'll talk about that later, but that's most likely privately. Um, there's another avenue. They could be putting on a false front. But the point is that they still have their problems. I think once we begin to understand and accept human nature, specifically as we talk about marriage, I think that will help us a lot in regards to times when our spouses stumble. And you would hope that it would change our viewpoint dramatically, realizing, again, James makes it clear that every one of us has these types of issues, and we're going to carry those into the marriage bond. With that being said, let me make another statement. And I am certainly not suggesting we overlook blatant sin within our marriages. But I'm simply stating that since the very beginning, with the time of Adam and Eve, marriage partners have been falling short. So this isn't something that's new. It's something we read about from the very beginning. Now, again, a lot of people will try to compare their spouses to perfection. But as I thought about this, guys, there's only one person that was ever perfect, and they never even got married. So the chances are of us actually getting through our marriages without having these types of issues is biblically certain that it's not going to happen, and two, it's not logical. Listen to Romans 3:23. It says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." Remember, we're going to carry some of that baggage into our marriages. And so it's very clear to me that this issue of stumbling and falling and issues in our personal lives is not going to stop just because we got married. Just because we got married. And again, I would go back and say, you think about it, we're so love struck oftentimes before we get married, we think it's going to be perfect. But the reality of the matter is that all people in some way from time to time do offend. And I think when we begin to embrace the biblical truth that every spouse is going to stumble from time to time, I think one that helps me to prepare for when those events actually do happen. It also helps me to prepare for when I fall short. At least it should. And again, I'm not suggesting that we accept that. I'm suggesting we ought to be prepared for the reality of it. If you're sitting here right now and you say, well, you know what, my marriage isn't perfect, I would say to you, well, you should have known from the very beginning, based on human nature and based on what the Bible teaches, that it's not going to be. And if you thought marriage was going to be easy, you certainly didn't have a full understanding of what marriage includes. And so as we understand this, I think that helps us that instead of focusing on the occasional disappointments, which we know will happen, we ought to be extremely grateful for all the positive acts that we see within our spouses. And as I thought about this, yes, everybody does stumble, but not everybody loves. Not everybody maybe takes care of their family the way that your spouse does. I would go so far as to say there's probably not an awful lot of people who would have put up with me for 30 years, and you could probably say the same regarding your marriages. A lot of people would not have put up with that. And so by accepting some of this understanding of the negatives and that they're inevitable, I think it does allow us to appreciate the positives at the same time. And hopefully every person here, as we're going to talk a little bit about marriage and the problems within marriage, would say, yeah, I have had to deal with hardships in my marriage, but when I go back and look at it, the goods outweigh the bads, and that really makes it all worth it. Now, again, it is a given that both spouses within a marriage will have hardships and struggles and issues. And if those areas are occurring or if there are unmet needs, neither of you can really fix what you're not aware of. So one of the things I would suggest, and I think this is the hard part within marriage, right? Human relationships include offenses. Many people just take those and they hold them in and they let that build up, right? And so many marriages are impacted by, sometimes a spouse may not even know what they're doing. One of the hard parts is that we have to actually sit down and let our spouse know about these issues and the desire to overcome these issues or whatever these unmet needs actually are. And so for that to take place, there's going to unfortunately have to be an awful lot of, at times, hard, honest conversations. You may say, well, how are you going to do that? Well, there's a number of ways that I'm going to mention real quick and move on. It may be that within your marriage, it's as simple as you guys spending time together, realizing and acknowledging there's an issue and just digging into the Bible and dealing with it. And for many Christians, that's more than enough to be able to sit down, to look at whatever these issues are or unmet needs are, and just getting in the Bible and saying, this is what we find and this is how we ought to deal with it. It may be much deeper than that. It may be the need that one or both of you within your marriage need individual counseling of some sort. It may be that you as a couple need marital counseling. If you're lucky, it may be that you have another couple within the congregation, or another couple that you know who has a lot of wisdom and experience, who can really sit down and help you. Those are all different avenues. But all of that is based on the fact that, one, human relationships do include offenses. None of us are perfect. And because we have those issues, we then have to have the honest conversation on how we deal with them. Now, again, that's a very general statement, but I think if you go into marriage knowing there's going to be issues, and at times I'm going to have to work to remedy those issues, I think that helps a lot. And again, you've heard people say, well, the grass is not greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it. That's true. I think the issue is there are going to be issues. How hard are you going to work in remedying those and making your marriage as good as you can? Let me talk about another issue, and for many of us, we have all heard this. We've all had friends. We've all heard this at work. We've heard it wherever in different avenues, where we're talking to somebody and they are talking about their spouse, and the complaint is this: well, they're the problem. They're the problem. And I'll be honest, oftentimes we'll listen to that, and if it's a female talking to a female, they can easily jump on the bandwagon, right? I see the same problem with my husband. And if it's a male talking to another male, he can easily jump on the bandwagon. Same problem, right? I see those in my wife. Let me give you some of the top complaints from wives. This is taken from the old Google machine. One of those was lack of communication and listening. A lot of women say that their husbands just don't listen to them, or something like that. Right? We've all been accused of that as husbands. Another complaint was that husbands are emotionally disconnected. Probably have heard of that from some other person complaining about their husband. Unequal division of labor around the house. Now, I think oftentimes that's a one-sided argument. I never complain about my wife not changing oil or doing whatever, but oftentimes we get into our own little sphere of this is what we do, and we feel like we never get helped out. And that's one of the complaints from wives regarding their husbands. They don't help enough around the house. And to be honest, they may not. I'm raising my hand here. Another complaint: lack of appreciation and support. Lack of shared activities. And here's a big one: husbands who prioritize other things, such as jobs, hobbies, whatever, over the marriage or over the family. So wives have an awful lot of things to complain about regarding their husbands, and many of those may be true. Let me flip the coin. Here's the top complaints from husbands. Lack of intimacy or desire from their wives. Wives being overly critical or controlling. Wives actually prioritizing children or other relationships, such as their best friends, over the marriage. Wives not caring about their appearance. Lack of emotional support. Now again, let me say this regarding both husbands and wives and their complaints. You may say, well, why didn't we see all this before we got married? Well, let's go back and just read Song of Solomon, right? Right before we get married, everything's perfect and they can do no wrong. And even when we first get married, oftentimes, same thing. They're all perfect, they can do no wrong. And I'm sure I could go back and list a whole number of other areas here where men and women feel that their spouses are the problem. I think we can all agree, if we go back to the very first account of the first married couple with Adam and Eve, when they sinned, that they did it through their own free will by disobeying God in the garden. But I want to go back to what Adam said. Listen to what Adam says about his bride. And remember, he was so excited when he gets his bride there. But afterwards, he says in Genesis 3:12, and the man said, the woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. What was he saying there? Do you guys notice the deflection? My wife is the problem. she's the one that actually started the whole thing going here. It's not me. My wife is the problem. And I would say many women would say the same thing regarding their husbands, and many husbands would say the same things regarding their wives. Many marriages are filled with spouses just like Adam, who would literally go back and blame their spouse as being the entirety of the problem. And again, I'm not saying there aren't marriages where one spouse is virtually the entirety of the problem. That does exist. You probably know marriages that have been destroyed literally by one of the spouses. What I'm suggesting here is that oftentimes, like in Adam's case, he's just as guilty, and yet he comes back and he looks at his bride and he says, she's the problem. Well, part of the problem is that we view our spouse as the problem, and we really refuse to look within ourselves. Adam should have actually been able to look within himself and say, okay, yeah, she was part of the problem, but I'm also part of the problem. And I don't think Jesus could have been any clearer over in Luke 6:41 through 42, when he said, "And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but perceivest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Either how canst thou say to thy brother, Brother, let me pull out the mote that is in thine eye, when thou thyself beholdest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, cast out first the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see clearly to pull out the mote that is in thy brother's eye." If you go back and remember our very first point, it was that we offend in many things. Now, if you're thinking, yeah, but in my case, my spouse really is the worst sinner, I would have to go on and say then Jesus is literally talking about you, because you don't seem to understand. Oftentimes within many relationships, we'll place the blame on one when in reality we had either just as much or at least partial blame. Oftentimes, yes, a spouse may struggle in one area that affects the marriage, but they'll oftentimes focus on their spouse in another area that affects the marriage. And so you'll hear maybe two people talking, and one of them's sitting there blaming about their spouse and whatever the issue is, but the problem is they're not willing to turn around and look within themselves and say, in what way have I fallen short here? Again, that's the same thing we have with Adam, who's not willing to look within himself. He wasn't really willing to point out or at least admit up front his own shortcomings. Let me give you just a few common sins or negative patterns in marriages where one spouse may fall short. And I'm going to say this because of me listing a few of these, you may say, well, yeah, I do see that in my spouse, but in listing some of the other ones, you may say, but actually I think I'm probably responsible for some of these myself. I'm not suggesting they don't both need to be fixed. They do. But it's oftentimes easier for us to look at someone else and say they're the problem when in reality we've got our own problems. Selfishness. I think we start off with that word. Me, 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 me. That is a serious problem. It's according to the statistics I looked up over the weekends as I was working on this, and luckily I had 2 weeks to work on it. I think selfishness was the major cause in the majority of divorces that were listed. If you look at the actual issue of why they got divorced, and then you look at how that happened, it was selfishness. So selfishness is one of the first. How could it manifest itself? Well, in a bunch of ways. One of the spouses prioritizing personal desires above the well-being of the relationship or their spouse, refusing to compromise, refusing to work towards solutions that would benefit both partners. Selfishness, I think, is one of the biggest issues we find within marriages. And you'll have one spouse talking about how selfish their spouse is, not realizing that in many ways they are just as selfish. And it goes back to the first point. We all offend in many areas. Another big key that I found as I was looking through this as far as patterns and issues within marriages that caused either the marriage to break down or to suffer was ignoring a spouse's physical or emotional needs. And I wrote that in both ways because it affects both spouses. What could this include? Well, it could include a lot of things, and both of those would affect either the husbands and or the wives. It could be poor communication. It means one maybe is not actively listening to the other. It could be that one is shutting down altogether and they virtually are not having conversations. How many of you guys it's never happened here, I'm sure, but how many of you guys have ever seen someone employ the silent treatment, right? Like, are you mad at me? Oh, they must not be mad at me because they're not talking to me about it, so it must be good, right? There's part of the problem, right? I'm avoiding and pushing off their emotional needs to try to have a conversation to me about the fact that there's a problem. Okay, just one of those areas. This could also be criticizing. It could be blaming instead of expressing needs and desires constructively. It could be literally, not that I've seen this happen before. It could be literally the husband not coming home to see his wife because he's so aggravated and mad at her, so he just volunteers for overtime. Probably none of you have ever seen that. I've literally had people say, "Can I work overtime?" I'm like, "You need the money?" "Nah, I just don't want to go home to my wife." That falls into the issues here of ignoring a spouse's physical needs, emotional needs. It works on both sides. Lack of forgiveness and holding grudges. Yeah, that happens quite a bit. Could be pride and the inability to admit mistakes, to admit that, yeah, you're not perfect. Could be the inability or the lack of desire to actually apologize. Could be the lack of ability to be vulnerable with your spouse. And let me make another side note here. It may not be that you have a lack of desire of being vulnerable and having emotional types of conversations or delicate types of conversations regarding issues with your spouse. Part of it may be you were never taught how to carry any of that out, and it is so uncomfortable to you, you just bottle it all in and you just keep quiet. People wonder, well, I don't understand why my husband's not happy, or I don't understand why my wife's not happy. Well, part of it is they're not telling you what the problem is, right? And I can remember listening to people say, just tell me. If you just tell me. Guys, we try to be fixers, don't we? You just tell us, we'll try to fix it. That's not what our wives want usually. They don't want us to try to fix it. They just want us to be emotionally vulnerable and listen. They just want us to understand what they're going through. What are other areas? Could be anger, could be lust, could be laziness, could be greed, could be envy, could be discontentment by really failing to appreciate all of the blessings that you have within your spouse that you saw when you first got married, but now you don't really recognize anymore. So here's the real issue. One issue may be one spouse may be just as guilty as the other in areas of sin or falling short, or in needing to improve as a spouse, and yet because they do like Adam, they're not going to focus on their own shortcomings. They'll turn around and they'll focus on their spouse's shortcomings. And Jesus makes it pretty clear that, yeah, it's not wrong to try to help somebody, but you need to acknowledge the fact that you got your own problems you probably need to work on. And again, if we're going to be honest within our marriages, both the husband and the wife, I guarantee you have areas they need to work on or they certainly could improve upon. And so again, there needs to be some introspection and looking at ourselves and asking, what things can I do better instead of focusing so much on the negatives for my spouse? And I'm going to come back really to that here in this next point. Let me focus for just a little bit on praiseworthy thinking. There is a need for praiseworthy thinking. We know that from the scriptures, and we know that regarding the majority of relationships within our life. Listen to Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good rapport, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Now, certainly I think Philippians 4:8 is as relevant for marriage as it is for life as a whole. Whatever is true, whatever is honest, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is virtuous or praiseworthy, we're to think about those things. Let me point something out. Did you know that obsessing over your spouse's weaknesses doesn't make them go away? And many of you probably have known somebody who has been aggravated at something their spouse has done for 25 years, and it literally drives it. And it could be something just completely silly, right? It could be the fact that maybe they cut their toenails in the living room and let them fall on the carpet and they never pick them up, right? I don't do that, but I'm just suggesting it could be something like that you literally deal with for 25 years and you want to strangle your spouse because they will not quit doing that, right? Yet you'll overlook the fact that they are the best provider. As a wife, maybe they do the best job in rearing the family, taking care of the family. They might be working outside of the home. You will overlook virtually every single thing and every blessing your spouse has ever given to you because they, for 25 years, have been cutting their toenails and leaving them on the carpet. And my point in saying that is, oftentimes that's what we do. We just focus on the negatives. Now, certainly it goes back to that previous comment. There probably are some hard conversations that need to be had when we have issues. I would think after the second, third, fourth conversation about please don't cut your toenails on the carpet, right? They would, I guess I'll say, fall in line and quit doing it. But I'm using that as an extreme example. Common sense and studies have actually shown that regularly thinking negatively about your spouse, it actually increases the dissatisfaction that you have with them and your marriage. Of course it does. That's pretty natural. I wouldn't even think you'd have to have a scientific study on that. If I think negatively about my spouse all the time, I'm going to think negatively about the marriage in general as a whole. And so when I say go back and begin to focus, if you can, on your spouse's strengths, I'm not minimizing that they might have weaknesses and they do things like cutting their toenails and leaving them on the carpet. And I'm not minimizing the other areas of those things that need to be actually stopped or fixed. What I am doing is saying make the daily effort to go back and to look at, make a spiritual choice to look at those things regarding your spouse and the qualities in which you should feel thankful. Again, before you got married, it didn't drive you nuts that they were cutting their toenails on the carpet and leaving them there. Right? They could do no wrong. Yeah, but about a month and a half, 3 months after that, you're like, I'm going to literally strangle my spouse if they cut their toenails on the carpet one more time. Even though in maybe many other areas, they are doing an excellent job. I think many of us who are married would have to admit that we oftentimes overlook the amazing benefits and the needs in which our spouses fulfill for us. But here's the problem as I thought about it in the last 2 weeks when I was working on this. You may say, why is it that we don't always have praiseworthy thinking regarding our spouses? And it dawned on me that pretty much at every workplace, at the water cooler or every sitcom on TV is literally constantly playing into the stereotypes regarding both husbands and wives and literally making them the punchline of a joke. We hear it all the time. People are making jokes about spouses, whether it's the husband or the wife. You watch sitcoms, and both of them are literally degrading and putting down the spouse as a joke. We don't see oftentimes for us and modeled correctly praiseworthy thinking of one's spouse. We always see the flip side of the coin. Yeah, our spouses are going to have bad days. Yes, we're going to have a bad day here and there. Instead of running down our spouses and thinking the worst, what we ought to do, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, if you literally ever just sat down and thought about making a list of what is true about your spouse, what is noble about your spouse, what is right about your spouse, what is pure about your spouse, what is lovely about your spouse, what is admirable about your spouse. Think back to every one of those characteristics and qualities that attracted you to your husband or to your wife in the first place, and ask yourself, why do you overlook many of those attributes now? Why do we not think praiseworthy of our spouse as often as we should? Part of it is because society as a whole is attacking marriage and literally making spouses to be the punchline of a joke. Let's talk about this one for a second, cleaving through the hard times and the hard issues of life. I'm not going to go back and spend a lot of time on statistics regarding divorce and issues like that, but as I thought about it and I thought about taking a different approach, why is it that we have all these issues within our marriages? There's a number of answers to that, but let's start off by looking at the basic. Every single person comes into a marriage with different types of hurts and wounds and family and spiritual baggage. And you may say, well, how does some of that happen? Could be that your spouse grew up in a family where they were constantly teased by their siblings. It could be that while they were in school, they were constantly teased by their classmates. It could be that your spouse that you're married to now, before you got married, had a boyfriend or a girlfriend who broke their heart and literally causes them to have feelings of a lack of trust or something like that. It could be that their parents were abusive. It could be that their parents were neglectful. The wounds that occur in life to the ones that we choose to marry are so varied and far apart. And just like people bring religious baggage into the church, we bring baggage into our marriages. And part of the issue is when we are looking for a spouse, those things that are negative, those things that are hurtful, those things that we don't want people to know that we have dealt with, we push them down and we hide them because we want to present ourselves in the best light, right? So many times you don't realize the baggage your spouse has brought into the marriage until you've actually gotten married and you've been together long enough that some of those things finally start to come out. They've been pushed down so far, you didn't know about them, or the fact that it was even going to be an issue within your marriage because they were keeping it from you as a form of self-protection. There are times even within marriage we keep stuff from our spouses as a form of really some type of self-protection. But because of all these things that they drag into the marriage, there may be existing issues within your marriage, things such as maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's depression, maybe it is a lack of a sense of trust, maybe they have low self-esteem. And you look back and you're like, I didn't notice these things prior to becoming married, and yet now they seem to be a problem. Part of the reason is you either overlooked it because they could do no wrong. I remember those days, don't you? The one that I'm so in love with that we read about, like when we read from Song of Solomon, right? They're just everything I've wanted. They can do no wrong. And you look past some of that, or the other side is some of that was kept hidden and pushed back because they were trying to put their best foot forward, right? And oftentimes maybe they think they've already overcome it. And so before you ever get married, many of these things are overlooked. And what's interesting is the things we never noticed or the things we didn't care about oftentimes have a funny way of later us turning around and saying, why do they have to be that way? And even if we didn't know about those things initially, they nurtured feelings of compassion and how can I help that person? And eventually those same hurts tempt us really to become bitter and oftentimes regretful. I saw this quote, and you've probably heard it, and I think it's true. A perfect marriage is just two imperfect people who refuse to give up on each other. I think that statement, when I look at it from a biblical viewpoint, is really the process of cleaving. It goes back to the very first point. We all offend in many ways. When we become spouses, the idea of two perfect people refusing to give up on each other, I think goes back to Matthew 19:5. This is the process of cleaving, right? And he said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. No matter what baggage you bring into the marriage, the things I didn't maybe know about, the issues that come into place during the marriage, things that maybe you never dealt with before, but now you're struggling with, all of those don't mean anything because I've made the promise I'm going to cleave. I'm going to help you through it. We're going to deal with it because of this cleaving process. So here's the question. If you do know about some of these issues beforehand, you've got to ask yourself the question, am I willing to deal with this person's wounds? And if so, once I make that commitment to become married to them, do I truly in my mind have the understanding of I'm going to cleave to them no matter what it is that this problem is that they are carrying into the marriage? And many times we know when we marry someone, yes, they have personality flaws, or they have whatever it is that you're dealing with. You realize it going into it. But are you making that commitment yet? Even in spite of all of this, I'm willing to cleave to my spouse. And again, you may say, well, how do I get through all of it? Well, it's going to again vary. Could be individual counseling, could be marital counseling. Many of these things, like I said, don't really pop their head up until years later. Again, it may just require you sitting down and studying through the scriptures and saying, how do we deal with this? Or having, again, somebody who's been married for a very long time, hopefully another Christian couple who could come back and who can help you look at areas in which you can deal with these things and you can improve them. But the promise to cleave was the basis of the marriage bond. You know, I was thinking about the last marriage I did, and you go back and you look at the common statement that's made. I think it should be worded just a little bit different, right? For better, you cleave. For worse, you cleave. For richer, you cleave. For poor, you cleave. In sickness, you cleave. In health, you cleave. In loneliness, you cleave. In sadness, you cleave. No matter what the wound is that you carry or that your spouse carries, you cleave. That has got to be a key for any marriage bond. When you go back and you list the many host of problems that could exist, every one of those, I think, can be overlooked or resolved through the concept of, I'm going to choose to cleave. Remember, I said I think the number one reason for all divorces is selfishness. And you as spouses cannot be selfish when you have the mindset of, no matter what it is, I'm going to choose to cleave. Let's talk about building up our spouses through respect. I actually had a couple different verses here, and then I took them off, and I thought, let me go back and just look at one passage. There's quite a few passages I could have listed. I think what it comes down to is if you're a Christian, you need to understand that going into marriage, one of the primary focuses and understandings about your spouse is they are worthy and they deserve respect. Listen to Ephesians 5, 28 through 33. I chose this because it really deals with both sides. Ephesians 5, 28. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. I'm going to tell you right now, if a husband does that, there is clearly respect for his bride. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. Now, there's a whole host of other passages I could have gone to that talk about this love and this respect that we have for our spouses. Let me point something out that the Bible doesn't say. The Bible doesn't say wives only have to love and respect their husbands if they're perfect. And the Bible also doesn't go back and say husbands only need to love and respect their wives if they're agreeable and meet whatever desire or demand it is that they have. The Bible doesn't do that. There aren't any qualifiers, and the reason there are no qualifiers is because biblical respect comes with position, not with the person. Here's what I'm saying. They're your spouse, and based on the fact that they meet the position of being your spouse, they are worthy of love and respect. Going back to the very first point, knowing that yes, they're probably going to mess up or stumble and sin and fall in some ways at some point. They are still worthy of your respect and your love. Your spouse is supposed to be a blessing from God. And our marriages are meant to glorify Jesus Christ and really reflect the love that we read about from Him within the Scriptures. Marriages are not some type of an easy kind of relationship, always to cultivate, but they are beneficial and they are blessings for us. The Lord calls wives and husbands really to do some very difficult things to try and help and foster healthy relationships within the home. And that would lead into a whole nother topic, which I'm not going to touch on, but we look at specifically roles within the family and specifically how it is that there are a number of things that both as husbands and wives we need to do to foster good marriages, but also at the same time to raise children with the goal that they will eventually one day become married and they will have an understanding of how it is that they also love and respect their spouses. You may say, well, how exactly do I build up my spouse through respect? I'll give you just a couple of things here. And this is probably something we all fall short on. One, praise your spouse publicly every chance you get. Don't criticize your spouse in front of other people, ever. Remember I said earlier, a lot of people will look at someone else's marriage and they'll say, they've got the fairy tale marriage. They probably don't, I'm sure of it. They have their own issues. One of the things you don't find, though, is the husband's out talking bad about his wife, and the wife's not out talking bad about her husband. So to everyone else, they don't realize that, yes, they have their occasional hiccups and problems, just like you do, but because they're not out flaunting it and talking about their spouse behind their back, you don't see it. So you look at them like, oh, they have the perfect marriage. Well, no, they don't, but they're praising their spouses publicly, and they're not talking negatively about them in public. And I think that's one of the most single important steps for us to follow, because once you do that, it immediately affects the marriage, immediately. For anybody who has heard from someone else, well, your husband is saying this, or your wife is saying that, or especially if you hear it and you're in their presence. I can't imagine, I'm not going to tell you who this is or where I know them from, but I am going to give you an example. I know the account of a person within the church who is qualified, I think, in every manner to be an elder, and I have never seen a spouse berate and beat down and embarrass a husband as much as I have seen that man, and he just takes it. And I'm like, how does a spouse do that to their spouse publicly? It literally is humiliating. Probably one of the best Christians I've ever known. And I don't know how a spouse could treat their spouse that way. And I hate to think what he thinks about it in his mind. I would suggest he has probably very low self-esteem at this point. I saw it take place for a very long time. We need to talk positively about our spouses. I'm not going to go around and tell everybody I want to strangle them because they've been cutting their toenails on the carpet again and just talking bad about my spouse, right? I'm going to find ways to build them up. There are times when people, and we know it is best just to keep your mouth quiet. Don't talk about it. It's nobody else's business. Yes, it's aggravating that they're cutting their toenails on the carpet, right? Find an area to build them up, not to break them down and to make them the punchline of a joke. Encourage and praise even the smallest, what we think are successes in your spouse's life. And when I say that, I'm talking about the mundane things, right? How often do we actually thank our spouse if they cook the meal? How often do you thank your spouse if they hold the door open? How often do you actually thank your spouse if they actually just go through the mundane act of going to work every day and providing for your family? We overlook those things every day. How often do you thank whoever it is that's doing the dishes? How often do you thank whoever it is that's cleaning the house, mowing the yard? The list goes on and on and on. The answer is we don't normally do it at all because it's what we do and that's what's expected of us by our spouse. And so even though they are in some way being extremely beneficial within the marriage bond and doing the things that need to get done, we don't say anything about it because they're just doing what we expect, even though they are blessing us time and time again through what we would call the very mundane acts of life. And so we don't praise them and we don't thank them. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I did actually go do it. Get on the old interweb if you don't know what your love language is, and there's actually a test you can go back. It took me 2 minutes. And go back and find out what your love language is, and have your spouse also take the test and find out what their love language is. You may know what yours is, but you don't know what your spouse's is. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe it is words of affirmation. Maybe it's quality time together. Maybe it is receiving gifts, physical touch, and intimacy. Maybe it's acts of service. If you don't know what that is, take the time with your spouse and literally just go on Google. I think it was the first or second one that came up. It literally was a quiz. It asks you the questions. You answer 1 or 2, 1 or 2, 1 or 2. And then at the end it says, this is your love language. This is how you feel built up and respected and honored by your spouse. Take it and then let your spouse know, this is what makes me feel important within the marriage bond. And you, likewise, have those conversations. It literally takes 2 minutes. And then actually build them up by focusing on what it is that they want to make them feel needed, to make them feel respected, to make them feel loved. Literally, it's 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes for both of you to do it together. And then at least you know. You may have no idea what it is that makes your spouse feel valued within the marriage. So just go in and type in, what's my love language? And take the quiz and tell your spouse, this is what I want you to do for me. Remember, Remember I went back earlier and said, just tell us. If you just tell us, we'll do it. We need to tell each of our spouses. Husbands, tell your wives. Wives, tell your husbands. This is what I need to feel valued within the marriage. I'm going to focus for just a second on prayer. Again, there was a study done on this. I don't know why. I think it's one thing to know that I am supposed to respect my spouse. It's an entirely another thing to actually go do it. And part of the question I had as I thought about this is so if I don't respect my spouse and build them up through respect, and I just gave you a couple of ways you could do that, is there a way that I can actually go back and retrain and refocus myself so that I can do a good job in building up my spouse? I will say this, men, we can easily be retrained. And I will say, women, you can also easily be retrained. And for many of us who maybe we're not very good people or good Christians even, we can actually look back and say, yeah, I don't do things the way I used to do. We can be retrained in how we think. And I think part of that has to go back to the concept of prayer, which is a practical tool for our marriages, both for praying for myself and the areas where I fall short, but also at the same time for praying for my spouse in the areas where they fall short, but for us praying for our spouse as a husband, as a father, praying for your spouse as a wife, as a mother, on a regular, ongoing basis. I think the benefit of honest prayer, and I say honest, again, don't go back and do what Adam did and said, that woman you gave me is the problem. That's not how we need to be praying. We need to have retrospection and introspection within ourselves and say, where am I falling short as part of my prayers? How can I come to a better understanding of how to remedy these problems, but at the same point praying for our spouse? And I think there's a twofold solution that takes place. One, when we do that, it roots out personal sin. At the same time, it aligns our hearts with the will of God for our marriage. And when I say that, what I mean is we are praying in alignment with the will of God. We are praying for what the Bible would have us to do, right? We need to pray, again, according to God's will. Let me give you a passage here. I'm going to go over to 1 Peter 3:7. I think I mentioned this earlier. I can't remember if I did or not. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel. It's talking there about physical structure. Husbands are normally stronger than their wives. As unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life. This is what I wanted to focus on. That you as a husband and a wife, that your prayers be not hindered. So it's already an expectation, according to the Scriptures, that we as spouses will be praying one for another. Now, I went back and looked, and the statistics show that the majority of people do not pray regularly, let alone for their spouse. The majority of people are not praying for their spouses. Although I did find there was a study on praying for your spouse. I wasn't surprised at the results. Researchers have found that prayer by both spouses in the marital relationship included the positive outcome of forgiveness. So if you pray for your spouse, it is much more likely that you will forgive your spouse when they fall short. Doesn't that go back to the first point? They're going to eventually fall short. Guess what? If you pray for them regularly, you're more likely to forgive your spouse. Another outcome was trust and unity. Okay, surprise. Decreased infidelity. So if I pray for my spouse every day, the chances of me being unfaithful to them go down? And the chances that they would be unfaithful to me go down? Yeah, of course. That's perfectly logical to me. If I'm praying for my spouse, I am going to be more likely to forgive them. There is going to be more trust and unity within the marriage. It is going to decrease the odds of infidelity. And then it says it also increases relationship satisfaction and commitment. Well, of course it does. And any one of us could have told you that anybody who is a Christian who is praying for their spouse on a consistent basis is constantly focusing on both their physical and their spiritual needs and how they, in turn, can also be a better spouse. Of course, that is what is taking place if you are praying every day for your spouse. I think one of the most important things we can do is to pray for our spouse on a regular, ongoing basis. And again, the statistics show the majority of people are not. And I'm not calling anybody out, but did everybody think about what you prayed for this week? How often did you pray for your spouse? Statistically, it will improve your marriage, which every one of us knows it will. Biblically, we know we should already be doing it, that your prayers be not hindered. So what's another way of dealing with the issues we have within our marriage? Well, part of it is based on prayer and the fact that that prayer is looking within ourselves for areas we need to fix and also praying for our spouse. All of that is a focus on ourselves and our spouses as it pertains to our marriage. Last point. It's only got a couple of verses. Modeling ourselves after Christ. Practically speaking, if we go back, and this kind of ties into a point I touched on earlier, every single marriage is based on what they have seen modeled before them, right? Much of what we do within our marriage and the ways we act within our marriage is based on things maybe that we saw from our parents. If our parents were very loving towards one another, there's a good chance that we're also very loving towards our spouses. If our parents fought all the time, or if we were raised in a family where the people that were raising us fought all the time, chances are that we oftentimes will fight much more than other people. But as I thought about it, because we lay an awful lot of blame on our parents, not that they're not perfect either, right? So our parents probably didn't model the best marriages for us. Parents aren't the only role model. I would say for the most part, secular media promotes some very poor ideas regarding marriage, right? Go back and watch sitcoms, watch movies. If you begin to think about what society says about marriage, the permanency of marriage, and so forth, we have a lot of wrong ideas about marriage. I think understanding God's purpose for marriage, I think, is probably one of the key steps towards having a more fulfilling marriage. I'm going to go back to Genesis chapter 1. Early in the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, we see the very first purpose for each individual. This ought to carry over into our marriages. Genesis 1, 26 and 27, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. We as individuals are to reflect the image of God. Marriages are to reflect the image of God. God's desire from the very beginning with Adam and Eve and all married couples is to reflect Him. And Paul then spends a lot of time, and I was going to spend more time in Ephesians, but I don't think I need to. Paul spends a lot of time in Ephesians chapter 5 dealing with the husbands and wives. We touched on a little bit of it earlier, but here's what's interesting. He summarizes the relationship like this in Ephesians 5:32. This is a great mystery. He's talking about marriage, about husbands and wives. But I speak concerning Christ and the church. Now, I want you to think on the implications for just a second on loving our spouses like Christ loved the church. And then you'd have to ask the logical question, well, how much did Christ love the church? He literally sacrificed himself in every way imaginable for the church. Would we sacrifice ourselves in every imaginable way to improve or to save our marriages? Would we sacrifice ourselves in every imaginable way to build up our spouses? Would we sacrifice ourselves in every imaginable way to safeguard our marriages? We go back and we look at what Jesus was willing to do for His love of the church, and He sets a standard for ourselves within marriage, and it's very different than the world, because the world says, do what's good for you. If things don't work out, just move. Leave the relationship. Find somebody else who's your perfect match. That's the complete opposite of what we find within the Bible. That's the complete opposite of sacrifice. That's the complete opposite of the idea of marriage. If we're going to love like Christ, I think we again go back to, and again, one of the most well-known passages, and it's used within the majority of probably all marriages. If we're going to love like Christ and have a love like Christ had for the church, we have to go to 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. And that's how I'll close this out this morning. Charity, that word love. Love suffereth long and is kind. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity or sin, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things. Let me go back to that one. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. I'm not going to finish verse 8, but he says, charity, love, never faileth. As spouses, we are to love sacrificially as we imitate the love of Christ. And I think as we go back and look at a number of these basic things within marriages, I think for me, it makes perfect sense that if I enter into marriage realizing that sometimes I'm going to be the problem, sometimes my spouse is going to be the problem, if I can go into a marriage like that, yet at the same time, in spite of all those things, I can go back and I can have praiseworthy thinking, knowing that yes, we will have problems, but no matter what takes place, or no matter what happens, no matter what their issues are before I married them, or whatever issues arise as I'm married to them, I will cleave to them through all of the hard times and all the hard issues as I build up my spouse through respect and through love. And as I pray for them every day on a regular basis, and also for myself to be the spouses and the parents that we should be, and through all of this, we both will model ourselves after Christ, because that's what's expected of us as Christian spouses. I only covered just a little bit of really what should be covered regarding marriage. I hope that's beneficial. I would say this for anybody who's watching this online: if those things sound extremely unusual to you, the answer is because they are, because that is not how the world tells people that their marriages should be. But that's what the Bible teaches for us as Christians. And if you're watching this and you're not a Christian, we would implore you to please obey the gospel. It's not complicated. Let somebody explain to you who Jesus is so you can believe and have faith, Hebrews 11:6. So you can repent of your sins, Luke 13:3 and 5. So you can confess Christ with your mouth, Acts 8, Romans 10:9 and 10, and so that you can be immersed in water for the remission of sins, Mark 16:15 and 16, and then so you can strive through this life to be faithful, 2 Timothy 4:7 and 8. As I draw this to close, if you're here and you've not obeyed the gospel, we'd love to study with you. If you're here and you are married, I would encourage you to go back and look at the areas not only where you can improve, but in those areas where you can build up your spouse so that you can be exactly what is expected of Christians who are married together, that we would imitate Christ in all things. And as I draw this to a close, if there's a way we can assist you, you can come forward as we're led in a song of invitation.